What if their silence isn't peace? What if the moment they disappear, shut down, stop replying, and act like they don't care? Something inside them becomes louder than anything they could ever say to you. Because here's the part nobody tells you. You think they're walking away from you. But sometimes they're running straight into the one place they can't escape, themselves. And while you're lying awake wondering, how can someone who once felt so close suddenly become a stranger? They may be fighting a battle they don't know how to explain. You felt the change before they ever admitted it. The messages became shorter. The warmth disappeared. Conversations that once lasted for hours suddenly felt like negotiations. You reached for connection, and they reached for distance. And eventually, their silence became so complete that you started questioning everything. Was I too much? Did I say something wrong? Did they ever really care? Maybe you replayed the last conversation in your head, searching for the exact moment everything changed. Maybe you watched their online activity and wondered how someone could have enough energy to exist in the world, but somehow not enough to answer you. And that kind of silence doesn't just create distance. It creates a psychological vacuum. Your mind starts filling the empty space with the worst possible explanations. But listen carefully. Their silence does not automatically mean they stopped feeling. Sometimes silence is what happens when a person has feelings they don't know how to regulate. When closeness activates something inside them that feels more dangerous than loneliness. When intimacy stops feeling comforting and starts feeling like exposure. And this is where their internal battle begins. Not necessarily because they're secretly preparing to come back. Not because every silent person is deeply in love. But because avoidant behavior can sometimes be less about the absence of emotion and more about what emotion demands from them. So today, we're going inside that silence. We're going to uncover 4 battles that can begin when an avoidant pulls away, and why their disappearance can reveal more about their emotional wiring than their words ever did. Because you deserve to understand what happened without turning their silence into a verdict on your worth. There is a strange contradiction at the center of avoidant behavior that can be incredibly painful to experience from the other side. The closer you get, the more distant they may become. And if you have lived through this, you know how confusing it feels because it doesn't follow the logic your heart expects. You think closeness should create security. You think when 2 people care about each other, emotional intimacy should make the relationship stronger. You think being honest about your feelings should bring 2 people closer together. But for someone who has learned to protect themselves through emotional distance, closeness can sometimes activate the exact fears they have spent years avoiding. And that's why the change can feel so sudden. 1 week, they're opening up. They're telling you things they don't tell everyone. They're staying on the phone late at night. They're asking about your day. They're remembering tiny details. They're looking at you in a way that makes you believe something real is happening. You start relaxing. You start trusting. You allow yourself to imagine a future. Then something changes. Maybe you ask for more consistency. Maybe you express that you're becoming emotionally attached. Maybe you simply become more available. Maybe nothing dramatic happens at all. You just become important. And strangely enough, that can be the moment they begin backing away. This is where many people make a devastating mistake. They look at the withdrawal and immediately translate it into rejection. They don't want me anymore. I wasn't enough. I became boring. Someone else must have caught their attention. Maybe I imagined the connection. But sometimes the problem isn't that the connection wasn't real. Sometimes the connection became real enough to trigger fear. Think about what emotional intimacy actually requires. It requires being seen, not the polished version, not the confident version, not the version that can control the conversation and walk away whenever things become uncomfortable. Real intimacy means someone eventually sees the uncertainty underneath the confidence. They see your fears. They notice your contradictions. They discover the parts of you that you don't completely understand yourself. And when someone has built their emotional life around self-protection, being seen can feel dangerous. You may look at vulnerability and think, this is where we become closer. They may look at the same vulnerability and unconsciously think, this is where I can get hurt. Same relationship, completely different internal experience. That distinction matters because you may have been standing there wondering why your affection seemed to push them away. You weren't necessarily doing anything wrong. You may simply have reached an emotional depth they didn't know how to navigate. Imagine spending years learning that needing people is dangerous. You learn to handle your problems alone. You learn not to ask for too much. You learn not to depend heavily on anyone. You learn that if you keep enough emotional distance, nobody can disappoint you badly enough to destroy your stability. Then someone arrives who makes you want to break your own rules. That's where the conflict begins. Part of them wants connection. Another part wants protection. Part of them wants to be known. Another part screams, don't let this person get too close. Part of them enjoys your presence. Another part starts calculating the risks of needing you. And suddenly they don't just have feelings for you. They have feelings about having feelings for you. That's a much deeper conflict. They aren't only asking, do I love this person? Their nervous system may be asking questions like, what happens if I depend on them? What if they leave? What if they expect more from me? What if I disappoint them? What if I lose my freedom? What if they see something in me that I don't want them to see? What if I give them power over my emotions? And sometimes those questions don't arrive as conscious thoughts. They appear as behavior, a delayed response, a sudden need for space, less affection, less communication, a strange emotional flatness, an unexplained irritation, a desire to spend more time alone, a sudden focus on work, hobbies, friends, responsibilities, or anything else that restores the feeling of independence. From your perspective, it looks like they're losing interest. From inside their emotional system, it may feel like they're trying to regain control. That's why chasing them can sometimes make the situation worse. Not because your desire for connection is wrong, your need for reassurance is human. Your desire for consistency is reasonable. But when someone already associates closeness with pressure, repeated attempts to pull them closer can make their instinct to escape even stronger. And this is where you have to separate two things that people constantly confuse. Understanding someone's fear is not the same as accepting their behavior. You can understand why they withdraw without deciding that you deserve to be ignored. You can recognize their emotional defenses without allowing those defenses to become your daily reality. You can have empathy without abandoning your standards. That's important because people who become emotionally attached to avoidant partners can gradually start shrinking themselves. They stop asking questions. They become afraid to express needs. They analyze every word before sending a message. They wonder whether saying "I miss you" will scare the person away. They calculate how long they should wait before replying. They pretend not to care because caring seems to make the other person disappear. Eventually, they aren't even participating in a relationship anymore. They're managing someone's nervous system. And that is exhausting. You were never meant to become a professional regulator of another person's emotional distance. A healthy relationship cannot depend entirely on your ability to say the perfect thing, send the perfect message, maintain the perfect amount of space, and never trigger the other person's discomfort. At some point, they have to participate in their own emotional growth. Because here's the hidden truth about vulnerability. You cannot experience genuine intimacy without giving another person the ability to affect you. That's the bargain. Love creates vulnerability. Trust creates vulnerability. Commitment creates vulnerability. Being important to someone creates vulnerability. And there's no magical version of love where you get all the warmth, connection, affection, and security while remaining completely protected from emotional risk. That doesn't exist. So when an avoidant person feels themselves becoming attached, they may encounter something they have spent years avoiding, the loss of emotional control. They can't predict what you'll do. They can't guarantee you'll stay. They can't guarantee they won't get hurt. They can't guarantee they won't disappoint you. They can't guarantee the relationship won't change them. And that uncertainty can become overwhelming. This is why their withdrawal can sometimes happen precisely when you thought things were finally becoming serious. The relationship moved from fantasy into reality. Fantasy is safe. Reality has consequences. Fantasy allows someone to imagine connection without having to practice vulnerability. Reality asks them to communicate. Reality asks them to compromise. Reality asks them to acknowledge another person's feelings. Reality asks them to remain present when uncomfortable emotions appear. And that's where emotional defenses get tested. You may have interpreted their silence as a statement about your worth, but their reaction may actually be revealing the limits of their current capacity for intimacy. That's a very different message. And once you understand that distinction, you stop automatically blaming yourself. You stop asking, What did I do to make them stop loving me? You start asking a more useful question. What does this person's behavior tell me about what they're currently capable of giving? That's a powerful shift, because love isn't only about what someone feels, it's also about what they can consistently do with those feelings. Someone can care about you and still be emotionally unavailable. Someone can miss you and still avoid difficult conversations. Someone can feel deeply connected to you and still run when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. Someone can have genuine affection for you and still not possess the emotional skills required to build the relationship you need. Those realities can exist simultaneously. And that is one of the hardest truths to accept. You don't need to turn them into a villain. You don't need to convince yourself they never cared. You don't need to romanticize their withdrawal either. You can simply see the situation clearly. Their fear belongs to them. Your worth belongs to you. Their defenses are their responsibility. Your boundaries are yours. And if you keep those two things separate, you stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours to carry. Silence can become a form of emotional regulation for someone who doesn't know what to do with emotional pressure. That doesn't mean every person who becomes quiet is secretly overwhelmed by love. It doesn't mean every disappearance has some profound psychological explanation. Sometimes people withdraw because they are uninterested. Sometimes they are angry. Sometimes they're distracted. Sometimes they simply don't want the relationship. But when silence becomes a repeated pattern around emotional closeness, conflict, vulnerability, or expectations, it can serve a very specific psychological function. It reduces stimulation. It creates distance. It gives the person a temporary feeling of control. And if you've been on the receiving end of that silence, you know how different it feels. For you, silence may increase emotional intensity. For them, silence may decrease it. That's the paradox. You hear nothing and your mind becomes louder. They say nothing and their internal pressure may temporarily become quieter. You look at the unanswered message and think, we need to talk. They look at the conversation and think, I need space. You believe communication will solve the tension. They believe distance will solve the tension. And now two people are responding to the same emotional event in completely opposite directions. That's where the cycle can become destructive. You reach out because you're anxious. They feel pressured and withdraw. Their withdrawal increases your anxiety. You send another message. They retreat further. You ask for reassurance. They experience that request as another demand. They become colder. You become more desperate for clarity. Eventually, both people feel misunderstood, and neither realizes that the relationship has turned into a feedback loop. This is why the phrase, just communicate, can be too simplistic. Communication requires emotional tolerance. You have to be able to remain present while someone is disappointed. You have to listen without immediately defending yourself. You have to explain yourself without escaping. You have to tolerate the uncomfortable space between hearing something painful and deciding what to do about it. For some people, that emotional space is incredibly difficult. Silence becomes an emergency exit. The conversation becomes uncomfortable. The body becomes tense. The mind starts looking for escape. And suddenly, disappearing feels easier than staying. That's why someone can genuinely care about you and still choose avoidance. Again, that doesn't make the behavior healthy. It simply explains why emotions and actions don't always match. Someone may think, I don't want to hurt this person, then disappear. They may think, I need to figure out what I'm feeling, then stop communicating. They may think, I don't want this relationship to become complicated, then create even more confusion. From their perspective, they may believe they're reducing the problem. From your perspective, they're becoming the problem, and both experiences can feel real. This is why you cannot build emotional security by constantly trying to decode silence, because every unanswered message creates another question. Are they angry? Are they losing feelings? Are they thinking about me? Are they with someone else? Should I reach out? Should I wait? Did I make them uncomfortable? Was everything a lie? The mind hates uncertainty. It would rather have painful certainty than an unanswered question. So when information disappears, your brain starts manufacturing it. That's why silence can become psychologically addictive. You aren't only missing the person, you're chasing information. You want one sentence that will finally explain everything. You want to know what happened inside their mind. You want confirmation that the connection mattered. You want to know whether the person who once looked at you with warmth still feels something underneath the coldness. But you may never receive that explanation. And if your emotional stability depends on getting it, they still control your peace without even speaking. That's a dangerous place to live, because now their silence determines your internal weather. One notification can make you hopeful. 1 hour without a response can make you anxious. One social media post can destroy your mood. One short message can make you analyze the entire relationship. You aren't living in the present anymore. You're living inside their behavior. And this is where you have to reclaim something essential. You can understand why they need space without allowing uncertainty to consume you. You can give someone room without putting your entire life on pause. You can say, I understand that you need time, while also saying, I need communication and consistency in a relationship. Those two statements can coexist. You don't have to chase. You don't have to punish. You don't have to beg. You don't have to pretend you don't care. You simply stop participating in the emotional tug of war. Because the goal isn't to win against an avoidant person. The goal is to stop losing yourself inside the dynamic. And there's another hidden layer here. Sometimes silence isn't just about avoiding you. It's about avoiding the version of themselves that emerges around you. Maybe you make them feel emotionally exposed. Maybe you ask questions that force them to acknowledge what they're feeling. Maybe your presence makes them confront the fact that they actually want connection. That can be uncomfortable for someone who has built their identity around independence. If they have spent years telling themselves, I don't need anyone, and then suddenly they meet someone they don't want to lose, their internal story becomes unstable. Now they have a contradiction. I don't need anyone, but they miss you. I like being independent, but they want your attention. I don't want anything serious, but they imagine you leaving. I need space. But they keep checking whether you're still there. That contradiction can produce confusing behavior, and sometimes the person themselves doesn't understand it. That's why trying to force an explanation out of them during their most defensive moment may not produce the clarity you're hoping for. They may not have the emotional language. They may not know how to articulate the conflict. They may simply know that they feel overwhelmed, so they withdraw. Again, you don't have to turn this into a romantic story. You don't need to convince yourself that their silence proves they secretly love you. That's not the lesson. The lesson is much more powerful. Their internal conflict is not your responsibility to solve. If they need space, space can exist. But space without communication cannot become an endless excuse. A healthy relationship needs a bridge between two people, not a permanent gap. Eventually, someone has to cross it. Someone has to speak. Someone has to explain. Someone has to take responsibility. Someone has to say, this is what happened. This is what I felt. This is what I need. This is what I'm willing to do differently. Without that, you're not building intimacy. You're building a guessing game. And you deserve better than a relationship where you constantly have to interpret silence as if it were a language. There is a moment when distance stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like absence. At first, an avoidant person may experience withdrawal as relief. The pressure decreases. The emotional intensity drops. There is no difficult conversation waiting. No expectation to explain every feeling. No need to respond immediately. No need to confront vulnerability. They can return to familiar territory, their own routine, their own space, their own world. And for a while, that may genuinely feel good. That's important to understand because it explains why their withdrawal can look so convincing. They may seem completely unaffected. They may go out. They may work. They may laugh with friends. They may post online. They may appear to have moved on overnight. Meanwhile, you're sitting there wondering how a person can look so calm after something that mattered so much. But emotional processing isn't always visible. Some people experience the emotional impact immediately. Others experience it later. Some people seek connection when they hurt. Others seek distraction. Some people talk about what happened. Others bury it. So the absence of visible emotion does not automatically tell you the depth of the internal experience. But there's another reason distance can change over time. When someone is close to you, they may unconsciously focus on what feels uncomfortable about the relationship. The expectations, the emotional conversations, the responsibility, the fear of being trapped, the fear of disappointing you. the fear of losing independence. But when you are no longer there, the emotional equation changes. The pressure disappears. And eventually the person may begin noticing what disappeared along with it. Your presence, your attention, your voice, your routines, the little things that seemed ordinary because they happened every day. That's how absence can become powerful. Not because absence is a manipulation tactic. Because humans often recognize the value of something differently when it is no longer constantly available. Think about a conversation you once had that seemed insignificant. Maybe you were talking about something completely random. Maybe you were laughing about something stupid. Maybe they complained about their day and you listened. Maybe you sent a message they didn't answer immediately. At the time, it was ordinary. Later, it can become memory. And memory has a strange ability to remove the pressure from an experience while preserving the emotional warmth. They may no longer remember the argument as vividly as they remember how safe it felt to talk to you afterward. They may no longer remember the disagreement as strongly as they remember the way you looked at them. They may no longer remember every difficult conversation. They may remember the feeling of being understood. That's when the mind can begin revisiting the relationship. Maybe I handled that badly. Maybe I pushed them away. Why did I keep creating distance? Why do I suddenly miss them now? But here's where you need emotional maturity. Do not confuse missing someone with being prepared to love them properly. That's one of the biggest mistakes people make. They hear from an avoidant partner after weeks or months, "I've been thinking about you. I miss you. I didn't realize what I had." And immediately, hope takes over. The heart says, "Finally, they understand now. Everything is going to change." Maybe, but maybe not. Feelings are not the same as transformation. A person can miss you without changing. A person can regret losing you without understanding why they pushed you away. A person can feel lonely without becoming emotionally available. A person can return because the absence hurts while still being unable to create consistency. That's why the return itself should never be the evidence you are looking for. The evidence is what happens after the return. Do they communicate differently? Do they acknowledge the impact of their disappearance? Do they take responsibility without blaming you? Do they tolerate difficult conversations? Do they stop using distance as the automatic solution to discomfort? Do they show consistency after the emotional reunion? Do their actions remain stable once the excitement fades? Those are the questions that matter. Because anyone can miss you. Anyone can have nostalgia. Anyone can feel emotional at midnight. Anyone can send a message when loneliness becomes uncomfortable. Real change becomes visible when the old trigger appears and the old behavior doesn't. That's the test. The person who once disappeared when intimacy became uncomfortable now stays. The person who once avoided difficult conversations now participates. The person who once expected you to guess what they felt now communicates. That's transformation. And until you see it, you have to protect yourself from turning potential into proof. This is especially important because avoidant dynamics can create something called intermittent reinforcement. You receive affection, then distance, connection, then silence, warmth, then coldness, a beautiful conversation, then nothing. That unpredictability can make the bond feel even stronger because your brain becomes obsessed with recovering the good moments. You're no longer simply missing the person. You're chasing the return of the version of them that made you feel chosen. That's why someone can know intellectually that a relationship is hurting them and still feel emotionally unable to walk away. The inconsistency itself becomes part of the attachment. And when the person finally returns, the relief can feel enormous. You think, see, they do care. But relief isn't always evidence of compatibility. Sometimes relief is simply what happens when anxiety temporarily stops. That's why you must learn to distinguish emotional intensity from emotional safety. A relationship can be incredibly intense and still be unstable. You can feel enormous chemistry with someone and still feel chronically uncertain. You can have powerful moments together and still lack the consistency necessary for a healthy partnership. And this is where your perspective needs to change. Instead of asking, will they come back? Ask, If they come back, what exactly are they coming back with? Are they bringing accountability? Are they bringing communication? Are they bringing emotional availability? Are they bringing a willingness to do something differently? Or are they simply bringing the same feelings that created the same cycle? Because if nothing changes, the reunion only resets the clock. The pattern begins again. Connection, hope, closeness, fear, withdrawal, confusion, silence, pain, return, and eventually exhaustion. You don't want someone to return merely because they discovered they miss your presence. You want someone who has developed the capacity to participate in your life without repeatedly destroying your sense of security. That's a completely different standard, and it protects you from another dangerous illusion. The idea that your absence is supposed to teach them a lesson. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. You don't control what another person learns. Your job isn't to disappear strategically so they finally understand your value. Your job is to stop offering unlimited access to someone who isn't capable of treating that access with care. That is a boundary. And boundaries are not threats. They are decisions. This is what I can participate in. This is what I cannot continue accepting. If you want a relationship with me, this is what healthy connection needs to look like. No manipulation, no revenge, no performance, just clarity. And if the person eventually realizes what they lost, that's their journey. If they don't, that's also information. Because your healing cannot depend on their realization. You may never receive the apology you imagined. You may never hear them admit exactly what they did. You may never get a perfectly worded explanation. And somehow, you still have to move forward. Not because what happened didn't matter, because your life matters too much to remain suspended inside someone else's emotional uncertainty. There comes a point where the most important question is no longer, what is happening inside them? It becomes, what is happening inside me while I keep waiting for them to figure themselves out? That question can change everything, because when someone goes silent, your attention naturally moves toward them. What are they thinking? Why haven't they replied? Are they missing me? Did they see my story? Why did they like that post? Why were they online? Should I send another message? Should I wait 3 days? Should I make them jealous? Should I disappear? Should I show them I'm happy? Should I tell them I don't care? And without realizing it, your life becomes organized around one absent person. They're not even physically present, yet they occupy enormous amounts of your mental space. That's the hidden cost of emotional chasing. You don't have to send 50 messages to chase someone. You can chase someone entirely inside your head. You can chase their attention through social media. You can chase their validation through silence. You can chase their return by changing yourself. You can chase an explanation through endless analysis. You can spend hours researching attachment styles, reading relationship advice, watching videos, comparing behaviors, and trying to decode what every little action means. And underneath all of it is the same question. How do I get them to choose me again? But what if that isn't the question you need? What if the more powerful question is, why am I willing to abandon my own emotional stability just to be chosen by someone who keeps making me question whether I'm wanted? That's not an easy question, because it forces you to look beyond them. It asks you to examine the part of you that keeps hoping the next message will finally make everything make sense. And there's nothing shameful about wanting someone you love to return. The problem begins when wanting them becomes more important than protecting yourself. That's the line. You can miss someone and still maintain boundaries. You can love someone and refuse to chase them. You can hope for reconciliation and continue living your life. You can care about their struggles without becoming responsible for fixing them. That is emotional strength. Not pretending you don't care, not becoming cold, not trying to punish them. Real strength is being able to feel deeply without allowing your feelings to make every decision for you. This is especially important with avoidant dynamics because the temptation is to turn everything into strategy. If I give them enough space, they'll come back. If I stop texting, they'll miss me. If I act independent, they'll become attracted again. If I become emotionally unavailable, they'll chase me. But now you're not building a relationship. You're playing psychological chess. And even if the strategy works temporarily, what happens next? You get the person back. Then the same emotional patterns return. Because the underlying problem wasn't solved. You simply discovered how to manipulate the distance. That's not intimacy, that's instability with better timing. You don't need to become mysterious enough to make someone value you. You need a relationship where your value doesn't depend on scarcity. Someone should not need to lose access to you before they remember how to treat you. Someone should not need to fear losing you before they become considerate. Someone should not need to watch you walk away before they understand that communication matters. Of course, people can grow. People can make mistakes. People can realize things too late and genuinely change. But change has a language. It's called behavior. If someone says, I understand now, watch what happens next. If they say, I don't want to lose you, ask yourself whether their actions make room for you. If they say, I'm scared, notice whether they're willing to work through the fear instead of using it as permission to repeatedly hurt you. Words can open the door. Only consistent action proves someone is ready to walk through it. And this is where your silence can become powerful, but not because you're trying to make them suffer. Your silence becomes powerful when it stops being a weapon and becomes a boundary. You aren't silent because you want them to panic. You're silent because you've already communicated enough. You aren't withholding affection to manipulate them. You're simply no longer begging for something they aren't currently willing to provide. You aren't disappearing to create curiosity. You're stepping back because your emotional health requires distance from a pattern that keeps destabilizing you. That distinction changes everything. One is manipulation. The other is self-respect. And self-respect is not loud. It doesn't need an announcement. You don't have to post a quote saying, you lost someone rare. You don't have to make sure they see your new life. You don't have to demonstrate how happy you are. You don't need to manufacture jealousy. You don't need to prove that you're moving on. You simply begin moving. You wake up and stop checking your phone first. You start putting energy into your work. You reconnect with people who make you feel like yourself. You exercise, you create, you travel, you learn, you laugh, you build. You sleep without analyzing their last message. You stop making decisions based on whether they might return. And slowly, something extraordinary happens. Your emotional center moves back inside you. Their behavior still matters, but it no longer controls you. If they text, you can read the message without immediately creating a future around it. If they don't text, your entire day doesn't collapse. If they return, you don't automatically surrender your standards. If they disappear again, you recognize the pattern faster. That's freedom. And there is another important truth here. You don't have to hate someone to stop chasing them. You don't have to call them toxic. You don't have to convince yourself that they are incapable of love. Maybe they have wounds. Maybe they have fears. Maybe they genuinely care. Maybe they're trying. Maybe they're not. But regardless of which explanation is true, you still have to live with the impact of their behavior. Intentions matter. Impact matters too. Someone can have good intentions and still create an emotionally unsafe relationship. Someone can be wounded and still wound you. Someone can be afraid and still be responsible for how they handle that fear. Compassion should never require you to become collateral damage. And if they do return, don't ask only, do they still love me? Ask, can they love me in a way that doesn't repeatedly make me feel abandoned? That's a far more important question. Because love isn't simply an emotion someone experiences internally. Love becomes meaningful through behavior, through presence, through honesty, through repair, through responsibility, through the ability to remain connected when things become uncomfortable. And if they haven't learned those skills yet, your love cannot learn them for them. You can encourage, you can communicate, you can be patient, you can understand, but you cannot do someone's emotional development on their behalf. That is their work. Your work is different. Your work is deciding what kind of relationship you are willing to live inside. Your work is learning the difference between patience and self-abandonment, between understanding and excusing, between giving space and waiting indefinitely, between loving someone and losing yourself inside their limitations. And perhaps the greatest shift happens when you stop asking, how can I make them stop running? And start asking, what kind of person do I become when I stop running after someone who keeps running away? because that person is waiting for you. The version of you who doesn't need to decode every silence. The version who doesn't confuse anxiety with chemistry. The version who doesn't mistake inconsistency for mystery. The version who can love deeply without begging for basic reassurance. The version who can say, I understand that you have fears, but I also have needs. I respect your space, but I won't live indefinitely inside uncertainty. I care about you, but caring about you does not require abandoning myself. That's the point where the entire dynamic changes. Maybe they notice, maybe they don't, maybe they come closer, maybe they stay away. But either way, you have stopped making your worth dependent on their decision. And that is when their silence loses the power it once had over you. Because silence can create questions. It can create longing. It can create confusion. But it cannot define who you are. Only you decide that. So when an avoidant goes silent, remember this. You may never know exactly what is happening inside their mind, and you don't need to destroy yourself trying to figure it out. Their silence may come from fear, overwhelm, emotional avoidance, confusion, or simply a lack of willingness to communicate. But none of those possibilities should become a reason for you to abandon your own peace. You can care without chasing, understand without excusing, and love without losing yourself. If they truly want a place in your life, let their actions reveal it through consistency, honesty, accountability, and effort, not through occasional words or temporary returns. And if they remain silent, let that silence become the moment you finally hear your own voice again. The voice that says you deserve connection, that doesn't leave you constantly guessing, love that doesn't require you to shrink, and a relationship where you don't have to beg someone to stay present. Their battle may be happening inside them. But your next chapter begins when you stop making their battle your home.